Hello and welcome to Unpreachy, a podcast of homilies and reflections by the voices of St. John Chrysostom Parish. Today, Monsignor Hank McKee reflects on Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33, the Gospel reading for Sunday, August 13th, 2023.
Have you had a nice summer? Hopefully some of you have gotten away, and Father Ed is away this week, so that's why I'm here. And I think he's down at the beach. You know, summertime is a season of water activities. Vacationers are swimming, sailing, boating, fishing in rivers, lakes, and oceans. When it comes to swimming, whether it's in a pool or the lake or the ocean, we have reason to do so with a healthy fear of the water. A healthy fear of the water. You know, lifeguards are at the beaches and at the pools for a reason. They're there for a reason. The Coast Guard, the Marine units are there for a reason. Maybe last week you saw on the news where a young man off the coast of Florida was rescued by the Coast Guard. His boat had capsized in rough seas. And if you saw the video, you see the Coast Guard approach his boat. He's hanging on it because it capsized. He's just holding on it. And they come and they rescue him, put him on a stretcher, and then take him to the hospital. And if you saw him, he was sunburned, dehydrated. There's a reason to have a healthy fear of the water. In today's gospel, we are told that Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and precede him to the other side. Out on the lake, the disciples become terrified. Why do they become terrified? It's not because the boat is being tossed about by strong winds and waves. No, they become terrified because they see somebody walking on the water. They're terrified because they see somebody walking on the water and they don't know who it is. They think it's a ghost. But Jesus says to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Realizing that it was Jesus, they calmed their spirits. And Peter says to Jesus, "If you will, I'll walk on the water." So Jesus says, "Come." But Peter gets out of the boat and begins to walk, but he becomes frightened because he becomes aware of the strong winds and the waves. And he begins to sink. And he cries out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus stretches out his hand, catches Peter before he sinks, and rescues him. Like Peter and the apostles in today's gospel, Elijah, in today's reading from the book of Kings, experiences a state of distress, anxiety, and fear. Before this passage that is read today, Jezebel has threatened to kill Elijah. Jezebel is the wife of King Ahab, and she has not liked what the prophet Elijah has said about her. And so in fear of his life, Elijah runs away. And that's where we pick it up today. He's hiding in a cave. He's running away out of fear. Elijah feels alone. He's distressed because the Israelites have not been faithful to the covenant. Feels abandoned by the Israelites. In today's reading, God responds to this distress of Elijah. God reveals himself not in the usual manifestation of the divine, like the earthquake, the fire, the wind. In today's experience, Elijah comes to know God in a tiny whispering sound. This tiny whispering sound assures Elijah that God was present with him, that he was not alone. We heard in that passage that he was touched by that tiny whispering sound. And in that, he came to know of God's presence. He came to know of God's presence. Paul, in that second reading today, in his letter to the Romans, speaks of his own personal anguish and distress. Did you hear what Paul said? This is what Paul said. I have great sorrow and constant anguish in my heart. Now why? Why does Paul have constant sorrow, great anguish in his heart? Well, you see, Paul loves the Israelites. He himself is a son of the Israelites. He's a Pharisee. He loves the Pharisees. He loves his family. They're all Israelites. He loves his friends. They're all Israelites. But they haven't accepted Jesus as Lord and God. They haven't accepted Jesus as the Messiah. So Paul is distressed that his family, his friends, his relatives, they have refused to accept Jesus. And Paul is feeling that great sorrow because he loves them. He loves them. And he feels bad that they haven't accepted Christ as Lord and God as Paul has. Elijah, Paul, Peter, and the apostles mirror the emotional distress that can touch every one of us. Every one of us at one time or another may have felt the anguish, the sorrow, the distress, the anxiety that these people of the Scriptures experienced. Sometimes we have been frightened and caused us to run away. Our lives have experienced sorrow. Our hearts have endured a sadness that sometimes lingers for a great period of time, that is reluctant to leave us, a sorrow that stays with us. We have at times felt alone. All of us at one time or another have felt alone. We have been afraid at times. Anxiety has touched us, invaded our spirit, our hearts and our minds. So what do we do? So what do we do with all these feelings and all these emotions? Well, let's look at the three people in the Scriptures today. I would suggest to you that Elijah would ask us to pay attention to the tiny whispering sounds in our own lives. To realize that there are tiny whispering sounds in our own lives that tell us that we are not alone, that Christ is with us, that the Lord is with us. Now, what are those tiny whispering sounds? Well, maybe it's someone who performs a random act of kindness for you. Maybe the Lord sent that person to you to perform an act of kindness. Maybe it's a phone call from a friend asking, how you doing? How's everybody? How's the family? Maybe it's a card you get. Just say hello, see how you're doing. Maybe it's just an acknowledgement of your presence in somebody else's life. Those are the things that reveal God's presence. I often think that God sends people to us to reassure us that we are not alone. And I think many times they are the tiny whispering sounds that Elijah came to realize that God was with him. Paul. Now, why is Paul in sorrow and anguish? Because he loves. He loves the Israelites. He loves his relatives and family and friends. He loves them. And because he loves them and they fail to accept Jesus, he experiences sorrow. So I think he would tell us that, guys, I hate to say this to you, that sorrow will touch your life. If you live life in love, you will experience sorrow. If you live life in love, you will experience sorrow. That's just the way it is. That's just the way it is. And Paul would tell us that. It doesn't mean that we don't feel anguish and sorrow. No, it's just the reality that sorrow will touch our lives. And being conscious of that. When we live with love, we will experience sorrow. That's what happened to Paul. He loved. He loved his people. He loved the Israelites. He loved his kin. And because of that, he experienced anguish and sorrow because they did not follow Christ. Peter. Well, I think Peter would advise us to just trust that the Lord is with us, that Jesus is in our midst. And that sometimes when we're anxious or fearful or afraid, to just sit and just imagine as the apostles on that boat experienced. Imagine Jesus saying to us when we're anxious and fearful, he says to us, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." And when we feel that we're sinking, that we're drowning, that we say to the Lord, "Lord, save me. Lord, save me." And imagine Jesus stretching out his hand. And as he grabs and catches Peter, he grabs and catches us. He catches you, catches me. Save me, Lord. Save me, Lord. Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid.
Unpreachy is a production of St. John Chrysostom Parish in Wallingford, Pennsylvania. Visit us at sjcparish.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. This podcast was produced by Brendan Lorden with music by Skytoes on Upbeat. Thanks for listening. Be well.